Kennedy asked to be brought back to the cottage to establish the story, and then after a while he could leave. Kennedy suggested that when he was back at Shiretown Inn, Gargan could discover the accident and report that Mary Jo had been alone in the car. How this was going to work out as far as details, the senator didn't say. Good morning, you guys. Welcome to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell. If this is your first time, I just want to say welcome to you, and I'd like to earn not just your like, but your subscription today. Let's dig in. We've been going through the book Chappaquiddick, and we have been going at a rather careful pace, trying to get all of the details. And so a quick overview is that we have gotten the look at how the accident at Chappaquiddick was found, how Mary Jo's body was found and what was observed about it, what Ted Kennedy's statement was about it, how the Kennedy machine was moving, and simultaneously how the wheels of justice and police work were moving. And then last episode, we got a look at Joey Gargan's testimony, or his story of how the night of the party happened. Today we are going to start out with Gargan's perspective immediately following the news of the accident and beyond. So let's go ahead and get right into it. This starts out with chapter 13. Gargan was in the kitchen when La Rosa told him, "The senator is outside. He wants to see you." Gargan was getting in the car when the senator said from the back seat, "You better get Paul too." So Gargan asked La Rosa to call Markham outside. You remember, Gargan had not been drinking. Markham had, because he had some sort of terrible leg pain. And so Markham had been drinking. He was in a lot of pain. Markham comes out, gets into the car. He puts his arm on the back of the front seat and says, "What do you want?" "There's been a terrible accident," Kennedy said. "The car's gone off the bridge down by the beach, and Mary Jo is in it." Now, I want to point out that all that we've just been told is from the inquest testimony. Months later, only Gargan and Markham were brought in, and the passive voice is used here in Ted Kennedy's first telling. That feels really important to me, that when he told them in this car, the thing he said was, "The car's gone off the bridge." Now, we have to ask ourselves, is this Ted's practiced way of getting out of responsibility? Is this him just doing what he's done all the way through his life? Or is this him telling the truth and later, for some other reason, they clean it up? There are people who believe that Ted Kennedy was not actually in the vehicle when it went off the bridge. And so when we look at these first tellings, that's something I look for. Which tense is being used? And here it's a passive voice, that the car has gone off the bridge. Gargan recalled, he didn't bark out orders. He made it clear he was driving the car and Mary Jo was with him. He didn't say how the accident happened. All he said was, "There's been an accident." The only thing that hit my mind was, "Go to the bridge as quickly as possible." Gargan guns down the Chappaquiddick Road to the intersection. He makes a sharp turn onto Dyke Road. He's proceeding slowly over the bridge when the senator points and says the car is there on the right. Gargan expected to see an automobile that had been driven into the water with the top sticking out. He saw something entirely different. The car was completely underwater, upside down in the middle of the pond. He said, "As soon as I saw that, I got sort of butterflies in my stomach. I realized if Mary Jo was in that car, there was no hope. This is done. She's gone." Considerable time had elapsed since the accident. Gargan begins to calculate. He's thinking the senator left the cottage and then came back. I knew from the distance that we had traveled that at least half an hour to 45 minutes had to have elapsed from the time of the accident to the time that we got back to the bridge. The situation was hopeless as far as Gargan was concerned. There had been one solution to the problem, he says. If a rescue attempt could have been made within the first few minutes after the accident, then maybe you've got a shot. That's his perspective. Gargan turned the Valiant around at the beach side of the bridge so headlights shone across over the water. There's the main part of Chappie, and then to the side is a long, skinny beach, and connecting the two is Dyke Bridge. So they went across Dyke Bridge and park on the beach side with their headlights shining back toward the main part of Chappaquiddick. Their beams impaled a small house on Dyke Road, not far from the edge of the pond. So Gargan begins taking off his clothes. He says Markham should do the same because he's thinking if we're down in the water, our clothes could get stuck on the car. We need to make sure that we're not caught on something when we're under the water. So he stands there naked on the beach, and Markham and Gargan both go into the water. Gargan says, all I was interested in was saving the girl. I wasn't thinking about anything else. I felt there was only one thing to do, and that was to get into that car as quickly as possible, because if we didn't, there was just no chance in the world of saving Mary Jo. So Gargan swims out to the car, and the water was cold, but not uncomfortable. The current was tremendous. He grasped a rod on the car's undercarriage and was able to hold on and still keep his head above water. So he is able to reach and grab a rod and still have his head above water. So that's how deep the car is at this point. Gargan begins to slide his feet down the side of the car. He says, I was trying to feel for where there was a window or a door handle. I was sliding down and then letting go and trying to get under the water. He couldn't do it. It says the force of the current dragged him away so that he was like 25 to 30 yards beyond the car before he got his body back under control. So this reminds us of what Chief Arena later described 10 hours later when he is also trying to dive down. The current is very strong. We're told that it's strong at night. I don't know if it's always that strong, but it was strong. Gargan asks Markham to just stay at the rear of the car to kind of intercept and grab him if the current starts to drag him away. He says Paul had all he could do to just hold on to the car against the current. He had been drinking, how much I don't know. So we've got a drunk guy holding onto the car, trying to keep Gargan from floating away. And then we've got Gargan, who had not been drinking. Remember, he was having stomach issues. And so he just drank sodas all night. And so we've got a drunk man and a sober man attempting this fruitless rescue, even though his instincts were get her out as soon as possible. You have to ask yourself, I ask myself, is any of this true? Did this happen? Why would they say this? Well, perhaps to save their own skin. Later, as it came out that perhaps she had lived longer, maybe they added this part. We don't know. No mention of this rescue attempt in Ted's first writing. So, was it added? Was he just forgetting? Was he only concerned about covering himself and not them? And so that's why he didn't include it in his statement. He keeps sliding down his feet, and after several more attempts, he realizes that isn't going to work. So he swims up to the front of the car, and working himself down the side, he finds an opening that he presumes to be a window, and he passed his body through, groping around to see if I could touch anything, he said later. You had to operate, listen to this, you had to operate by feel only. The current forced your eyes closed. So that's interesting. This could be why Mary Jo Kopechne couldn't get out. Some of you who know about Blackwater and even Upside Down, the things that would happen, have pointed out that she would have been in a great state of confusion if she had been asleep or partly drunk, and she either woke up or maybe lost consciousness and then came to. She would have already had a tremendous amount of confusion, but this would add to it. If the current, even inside the car, is so strong that your eyes are forced shut and you're just feeling around, boy, that would be incredibly confusing. He says the car was full, the current was running right through it. There was no air inside the car. There couldn't be. It was completely submerged. We know that the diver said that he had seen situations like this that still retained an air pocket for up to 5 hours. So it's not necessarily true, that there couldn't be. And remember the position of the vehicle, that back end was up higher. But he started losing breath. He tried to get out and couldn't. He got stuck inside. Listen to this. Because in turning to feel around, I had gotten jammed in. Instead of turning again calmly, I kind of pushed myself out fiercely. I feel something sharp rake his arm and chest as he passed out of the car, and he comes up to the top of the water. He's gasping for air. The current pushes him back, and Markham misses as he swims by, of course, because Markham's drunk as a skunk, apparently. Gargan ends up 25 yards away from the car, and Markham swims over and grabs him. Ted Kennedy, this whole time, he is up on the bridge watching the whole thing. And he's calling out, "Can you see her? Is she in there?" If he had already tried, which is his testimony, why wouldn't he be trying right now? I think there's a case to be made that he is crazy drunk. And that's why he's up on the bridge, because he'd be no use to anybody. Well, he's observing. And Gargan looks over in the wash of the headlights and sees that the senator is stretched out on the bridge on his back, hands clasped behind his head, knees drawn up. The senator was looking into the sky, rocking back and forth, repeating, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" And what I wrote down is, he's asking the question, what am I going to do? Joey is literally answering it in the next sentence. He conceives the idea of trying to open one of the car's doors. And so he dives straight down, holds onto the side of the car, finds a door handle and yanks as hard as he can, but the door wouldn't budge. He's puzzled because he could move the lock button up and down. So I guess through a window? It doesn't say through a window, but I'm guessing he can reach in and pull the lock button. He puts his knee against the body of the car and pulls, but the door wouldn't move. He couldn't understand why he's having such a hard time getting into the car. And so him being buoyant and then the current itself is just making it difficult for him to get any leverage at all against the door. He surfaces, he's sputtering for breath, and he just says, "I can't do it. I just can't get into the car." He says that this current was as swift as any that he had previously experienced. He said the water was bad. It was rough. "I almost drowned." That's Gargan's testimony. Gargan and Markham then climb out of the water and get up on the bridge, and Ted is standing in front of the Valiant. His hair is matted and very curly, his trousers clinging wetly to his legs. He asks if there was any way Gargan could think to get inside the car. Gargan says there is not. And Kennedy is just saying, "I just can't believe this happened." Now, the next little bit that we get is Ted Kennedy's comments, and this is taken from Gargan and Markham's testimony during the inquest that would happen in January. So let's listen. "He was driving down Dyke Road," Kennedy said, quote, "Before I knew it, I was on the bridge," end quote. "The car had gone over the side. Water had risen up to his chest. Quote, "I thought for sure I was going to drown. I thought that was it, and I just gave up. And the next thing I know, I'd come up to the top of the water," end quote. He had tried going back into the car to get Mary Jo out, but he couldn't do it. The only thing he could think of was to go back to the cottage to get help. He said, "I don't believe this could happen to me. I don't understand it. I don't know how it could happen." "Well, it has happened," Markham says. "What am I going to do? What can I do?" "There's nothing you can do," Markham said. So Gargan is getting dressed, and he says, "I had one thing in mind at this time, and that was to report the accident. I didn't say that when I was dressing, but I was thinking what had happened had to be reported immediately." Gargan gets into the car, not thinking. He doesn't see any lights on any house on Dyke Road. He says, "They may have been lit, but I didn't notice." He drives up to the intersection, and there's a discussion, like, what do we do now? Everybody's in this trance-like sleepy stage. He says they were stunned, they were horrified. We're trying to get the story together prior to reporting the accident. The accident is over, so we're reporting the accident now. Gargan intends to just go straight to get to the ferry landing. He says that's the location of safety. That's the place where we can get help. But in the back seat, Kennedy is still repeating himself. Do you believe it, Joe? Do you believe this has happened? We've got to report this immediately, Gargan said. He suggests that the senator call his aide, David Burke, and then go to the police. I thought he should let the family know what has happened. And particularly, Joey is concerned for Rose Kennedy. He says, I didn't want Mrs. Kennedy to hear about the accident on the radio or the TV, or have somebody call her up in the middle of the night to say, I understand your son has been lost in an accident. She had heard on the radio that Jack was shot, and she had heard about Bobby the same way. He said, I wanted to make sure she was told that Ted had been in an accident, but that he was perfectly all right, and she had nothing to fear. Markham is interjecting only an occasional, you're right, Joe. He's in no position of authority with Ted, whereas Gargan has this intimacy of having been first cousins who had a close relationship with Ted Kennedy. The senator was silent about his intentions, but it seemed like he did not want to report. He was having alternative ideas. Why couldn't Mary Jo have been driving the car? Why couldn't she have let him off and driven to the ferry herself and made a wrong turn? Kennedy asked to be brought back to the cottage to establish the story, and then after a while he could leave. Kennedy suggested that when he was back at Shiretown Inn, Gargan could discover the accident and report that Mary Jo had been alone in the car. How this was going to work out as far as details, the senator didn't say. I know many of you will say, well, see, he was already floating this idea, so perhaps that's what's happened. And I think that could be true. I think it's possible that Mary Jo had been driving the car, or that she was somehow alone in the car, that even they got up somehow and ditched. I think it's possible that Ted was in the car. I think it's possible that a second woman of some kind was in the car. And we have a reason for Rosemary's purse being in the car. In the last episode, we learned that she and another man had gone over the ferry and back to get a radio the night before, and they got back at like 10. It makes sense that her handbag could be in the car for completely innocent reasons. So, I don't want to cast aspersion on her necessarily, although that's the first name that comes to mind. But we're given no look at how any of the women looked that first 24 to 36 hours. We don't know if there were injuries. We don't know if there was a head injury, like maybe a different woman was driving. We just don't know. And so I think it's possible that what Ted said actually happened. I think it's possible that this alternative theory he's floating could be true. I think it's possible that there was somebody else driving, that Ted was drunk, Mary Jo's passed out in the back, or snoozing in the back, or just relaxing in the back, and someone else drives and goes. Gargan rejects this idea out of hand. It says Mary Jo was the only other person who could possibly have been driving the accident car, but neither the senator nor Paul Markham knew her very well. Gargan said later, quote, nobody even had any idea if she could drive a car or even owned a license. So this does mean there's at least an initial entertaining of this possible explanation. Even though Gargan is saying he rejected it out of hand, by getting to the point of going, well, we don't even know if she has a license, that at least shows that you're considering that story. Besides, Gargan reminds Kennedy, you told me you were driving. Gargan doubted he could persuade the girls at the party to allow Mary Jo to take blame for the accident. He says that he and Paul Markham had made plenty of noise at the scene of the accident. And he said, we had no certainty that other people on the beach, perhaps, or in the houses hadn't heard it all. So he says, we can't tell a story that we hadn't done those things. So this actually gives credence that it did happen just this way, that there was a rescue attempt by Paul and Joey, and that's why the story came out the way it did, because it had to be reported that they had known because there had been a rescue attempt. And they thought, well, if we don't say that, then people are going to say, I saw those guys out there diving and jumping and whatever. So he points out, making a false report to the police required a web of lies involving a disparate group of people. In addition, Gargan would be risking his integrity and reputation as a lawyer. To drive home the importance of reporting, Gargan invokes the name of Burke Marshall, who is who they end up pulling in. Bobby had said in my presence that he was the most capable lawyer he knew. I was advising the senator of this because he had a very serious problem, and it was important to get who, in Bob's opinion, was the best lawyer. Gargan is also calling upon the memory of Robert Kennedy as a reminder of the responsibility that the senator had to be an example. Gargan is sure that Burke Marshall will advise reporting the accident. He's sure that he would say to do the right thing. He says he's giving constant pressure. You've got to report this thing. You've got to report this thing. You've got to report this thing. Well, they pull up to the ferry landing and they can see the Edgartown lighthouse just across the way. Boats are bobbing. Nothing is stirring. The channel is as smooth as glass. Gargan had used the public telephone at the landing's ferry house that weekend, but gave no thought to using it now. I personally find these things contradictory. Damore seems to intentionally draw out the tension that Gargan is telling us. All I could think of was you have to report, you have to report, you have to report. And also, there's a phone that's a public phone that's in a private place. And he doesn't say, hey, go over there and go ahead and call. I'll stand right here with you. Just keep it quick, but make sure they know. He doesn't do that. He also doesn't report it himself. So Gargan says he keeps saying, call David Burke, call Burke Marshall. These two have to be called and then report to the police. That's his order of events. The senator seems unmoved. He's silent. He's brooding, trying to think of a different way. And finally he says, all right, Joey, I'm tired of listening to you. I'll take care of it. You go back. Don't upset the girls. Don't get them involved. Gargan and Markham watch him as he bolts from the car, takes 3 steps, and dives into the water. Gargan is furious, and as Kennedy starts swimming away, he says, I hope he drowns, the SOB. I mean, again, I'm like, well, why not just take your little self 20 feet over to the ferry house and make the call at the public telephone that's right there? I don't get it. Gargan somehow convinces himself the senator's final statement had been clear, reasonably clear, he said. He was going to report the accident. I was going to take care of the girls. I don't feel like Ted's been this clear. Do you? So he goes back and thinks, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take care of the girls. They start driving back, and then he turns to Markham and he says, I just don't think the senator alone in Edgartown is a good idea. I think one of us should be with him. We should go back to the ferry and one of us should swim across. Markham couldn't do it because he had his bad leg and he never would have made it, Gargan realizes. And so Gargan, I guess, is prepared to do it, but it says there was no sign of Ted Kennedy in the water when Gargan returned to the landing. He assumed the senator had made it across to the other side. He, quote, seriously considered, end quote, swimming to Edgartown to make sure that the senator was going to do what he had clearly said he was going to do. I mean, clearly, y'all, the statement is, all right, Joey, I'm tired of listening to you. I'll take care of it. You go back. Don't upset the girls. Don't get them involved. I just don't feel like that's reasonably clear at all. Oh gosh, we're still in chapter 13, y'all. I keep having high hopes for getting through a lot of material, but there's a ton of things here that we want to talk about. He says, I presumed that's what he was going to do. Take care of it. Whatever take care of it meant. And my comment was, this beggars belief that you'd trust Ted Kennedy, who did not even dive in with you to try to save Mary Jo, to suddenly do the difficult thing. I don't get Joey Gargan's thinking here at all, and I think he's dressing it up a little bit. Gargan is the only person on Chappaquiddick who knew the Boiler Room girls very well. He said, I felt I should go back to the party because I was the best one not to alarm them and to keep them calm. So he drives back. It says he didn't encounter another car and he hadn't seen any other vehicles or people on Dyke Road. It says Chappaquiddick was stifling emptiness. The night was hot. There was no air. There was that deadness. It was after 2:30 a.m. when Gargan returns to the party, and the cottage is dark. An outside light had been left on. Crimmins comes out to complain about being disturbed, and Markham collapses on the living room couch. There's two ladies there, Susan Tannenbaum and Esther Newberg. They were not in a very good mood at this point. When Markham kind of slumped back, Newberg says, "Watch out, you're laying on my legs." "I'm sorry," Markham says. "I'm exhausted. You aren't going to believe what happened." Markham's slurred voice, alcohol breath, etc., did not encourage further conversation. So Newberg gets up, goes back into a bedroom where the ladies are sleeping, and she finds sleeping space on the floor. Gargan was in the room talking to the girls. All of this is taken from Mary Ellen and Rosemary's testimonies at the inquest. Mary Ellen asks where he had been. Gargan says, "Oh, don't even ask. We've been looking for boats." Lyons recalls they said they had been down at the ferry landing swimming around, that the senator dove into the water because there was no ferry available to him and he wanted to get back to the other side. Because of his back, they said, they sort of instinctively dove in after him. So that's the story that Markham and Gargan are telling about why their clothes are wet. "Where was Mary Jo?" one of the girls asks Gargan. Lyons says, "He told me she was at the Katama shores, that she had taken the car on the last ferry." So this is as if he is preparing for a statement that Mary Jo was just the driver. Rosemary Keogh also asked Gargan, and he said not to worry about it, that Mary Jo and the senator had probably taken the ferry. So Rosemary Keogh's testimony is that Gargan said they both took the ferry. Mary Ellen's testimony is that the senator dove in and that Mary Jo had taken the last car on the ferry. So already Joey or the girls, somebody's lying. There's some amount of changing of the story. Hard pressed to explain his absence, Gargan had to keep the young women at the cottage. If they should return to their motel, they would know that Mary Jo was missing and could raise the alarm. And that couldn't be done until the senator reported the accident. This does not hold water for me at all. If you actually think that the senator's comments were clear and that he dove across with the intent of going to do this thing and you're just going back to be with the girls, and if one of them wants to go and report, then in your mind, you'd be thinking, well, he's going to make a couple of calls, then he's going to go to the police department. He's already a good hour ahead of anybody who would be coming behind. They would have to somehow get across the channel, go down to the Katama Shores Inn, find out that she wasn't there, and then make a police report, at which point the senator would have already done so. If you really believed that's what "I'm going to go take care of it" actually meant. So I don't believe Gargan at this point. I don't believe that he's telling the full truth about what he thought was going to happen and what his intentions were in this moment. It doesn't mean that none of his testimony is true, but I think we have to look carefully at what he's saying and whether his own internal logic makes sense. And to me, it doesn't. Gargan is trying to keep conversation to a minimum. He says, "I didn't want to discuss what happened. The senator was indicating that he was going to do what he said he was going to do. So my job was to do what I was doing." So Gargan lays down on the floor next to the screen door, quote, "to be the first to know if anybody comes into the cottage." It says he had no idea what to expect, but he was sure the senator was going to report the accident. His expectations were based, quote, "on the confidence I had ascribed to him in the past, because I saw him right after Jack's assassination. I saw him after Bobby was killed. He was a man under control, terribly shocked from the loss of his brothers, but still able to function." Well, after an hour passes, Gargan is not so sure. He wonders if the senator had managed to report the accident without involving the party at the cottage. but you couldn't imagine how that would be possible. Gargan was aware of the stirrings of would-be sleepers in the room behind him, and he is apprehensive. He's aware of Mary Jo's death. It says he's preoccupied with the senator's dilemma, and he's unable to sleep. Several hours still remain until dawn, and Gargan takes comfort from the thought that at least in daylight he'll be able to figure out what's going on. Markham, too, has a turmoil of doubts about what Ted Kennedy is going to do, and he said later, "We hoped Ted was going to report the accident, but we didn't know for sure what he was going to do. We hadn't gotten a real commitment from him, so we were foggy on that point." He walks out, comes back in to sit in a rocking chair, goes out again, stretches out in the Valiant to try to get some sleep, and it's dawn when Markham comes back into the cottage. Gargan's awake. There were a lot of people up at this time. Around 5 or 5:30, Gargan observed. Nobody slept very well. Gargan is eager to get to Edgartown as quickly as possible, and he knows that the first ferry goes over at 7:30 in the morning. He takes Markham and Charles Treader with him when he leaves the cottage, and Rosemary Keogh and Susan Tannenbaum wanted to go along also. Gargan regarded them as, quote, excess baggage, end quote. He said, "I didn't want to talk to them, have them along, or anything. I wanted to get away from them." But he couldn't refuse. Gargan leaves at the landing, and it says that he had Gargan, Markham, Treader, Keogh, Tannenbaum. They all go across on the ferry. And as he hurries up, he sees that there's not a commotion. And so based on instinct, he knows, I don't think the accident has been reported yet. They all part company at the bottom of a stairway landing. And Rosemary Keogh says she looks up and she sees Senator Kennedy standing on a porch outside his room. So Keogh sees Ted Kennedy at the hotel. Here are my observations for chapter 13. Limited people are in the know. Markham and Gargan did also not go to the Dyke House, and they did not use a public telephone that was available to them. We learned that the current forced your eyes closed. That would have impacted Mary Jo's choices in the moment of the accident. Ted Kennedy says he was driving, that he got out unexpectedly. So that's something new that we got in this episode. Gargan says his one thing in mind was reporting the accident. But I will point out, I don't think his actions match that. He drove past the Dyke houses. He completely ignores the Chappie Ferry Shack phone that's available to him that he had apparently used earlier that day. That doesn't make sense. Ted Kennedy at least flirts with pinning it all on Mary Jo. Now, this was the biggest and most explosive revelation from this book at the time that it was published. People were shocked that Ted had flirted with the idea of trying to pin the accident on Mary Jo. So that is one of the most explosive things that comes from chapter 13. And then Ted Kennedy runs out and swims across, and Gargan does not follow. Those are my observations from chapter 13. Is there anything else that stood out to you? If so, if I missed some, please go ahead and remind me of those in the comments. These are just the ones when I go back through, I flip back through the passage and try to remind myself. I actually do this with Bible study. This is the way that I have learned to study the Bible, is to read the passage and then to draw out the precise and as clear as possible in as simple language as possible, the precise observations that I can pull from the text so that I'm seeing what the text is saying and not just bringing my own interpretation to the text. And so that's how I'm reading this book, is just to look at the text and then remind myself what it actually said. Okay, chapter 14. Looks like this is all we're going to get through, is chapter 13 and 14. Here we go. So Ross Richards is walking on North Water Street around 7:15 a.m. when he meets Stan Moore. Moore had been wandering around since 5 a.m. Richards and Moore encountered Ted Kennedy in the alley that separates the Shiretown Inn from the inn next door. The senator is coming in from the lobby where he had asked the desk clerk, "Could you reserve the Boston Globe and the New York Times for me? And by the way, could I borrow a dime? I seem to have left my wallet upstairs." I mean, the wallet is going to be an issue all morning, right? When he goes to talk to Chief Arena and doesn't have a license. But I couldn't get over no wallet, no license, no dime, no common sense, no common courtesy, but ultimately no care for Mary Jo, right? That's what's the banner over his actions right now ought to be red alert, someone's died, and it's my fault. I mean, according to his own words. Now we could say maybe something else happened. Maybe he didn't even know about Mary Jo at this point. That actually would make more sense as why you're going around shuffling around for a dime from the desk clerk. But if what he has said is true, if what Gargan has said is true, then he is operating with an absolute lack of care for life. Could you give me a dime? Could you get me the Boston Globe? And someone has passed away, and he knows it and hasn't reported it. It's horrifying. It says that her observations as she gives him the dime are that he was freshly shaven, dressed in yachting clothes. He appeared normal in every way when he walked 30 feet to an outside porch and the inn's only public telephone. He calls Helga Wagner, who is a former German airline stewardess with whom he had established a romantic liaison. He told her nothing about the accident, she said. Quote, he just said something very serious had happened and I needed to have Stephen Smith's number in Spain. He knew I had it because I was on my way to Europe to join Stephen Smith and his wife, Jean. Jean is Ted Kennedy's sister. She is the sister that I believe was between he and Robert Kennedy in the Kennedy lineup. So she's the youngest sister, he's the youngest brother. We're told that she noticed that his skin feels cold and clammy to the touch when he gives back the dime he had borrowed. There's an innocent conversation that happens for like 15 minutes. Richard's wife comes out. They all says we were all chatting on the porch when Joey Gargan arrived. So they're having this little morning chat. Mrs. Richards is totally shocked at Gargan's appearance. Joey looked awful. His clothes were all wrinkled. His hair was sticking out. Even more startling was the uncharacteristically loud and coarse manner with which Gargan announced his presence, demanding to speak with Ted Kennedy at once. Gargan tells us, I was very definite about wanting to see him. My directness, my aggressiveness, the sense of urgency I had may have startled him. I more or less ordered him into the room. It was like, I'd like to see you right now. Get in there. Gargan had worked up a sweat. It says he was soaking wet because it was a hot, muggy morning and I was very agitated and eager to figure out what was going on. I had had a sleepless night with mounting anxiety. His temperature had soared higher when he looked up from the bottom of the stairs to see Ted Kennedy posturing up on the porch chatting, totally unconcerned, pretending that there was nothing wrong. From this view, Gargan, of course, realizes the senator has not reported this accident. And it was obvious to Markham, too, that nothing had been done. Kennedy is invited to go to breakfast, but Kennedy says, I can't right now, but I might join you later. He's still living in a dream world. Gargan, Kennedy, and Markham now go into Kennedy's room. What happened? Markham said, and Kennedy lays down on one of the beds. I didn't report it. Markham recalled, when we got over there and found out he hadn't reported the accident, we couldn't believe he hadn't reported it. What the F is going on? Gargan says. You were supposed to report the effing accident. Kennedy had swum the channel. He had slipped into the Shiretown Inn unseen, changed clothes, and then established his presence by asking an employee patrolling the premises at the time. Then he had gone to bed and awakened around 7 a.m. He betrayed no signs of having been involved in an automobile accident. It wasn't too late for the scenario that he had proposed to be put into effect. He begins trying to convince Markham and Gargan that they should go ahead and go along with the situation that he had come up with. It wouldn't be too difficult to convince people now that he hadn't known about the accident until this morning. The senator expected that the accident would have already been taken care of, that Gargan would have reported the accident and told the police that Mary Jo had been driving. Based on the fact that both Gargan and Markham testified that the thing that happened at the ferry where he ran off and dove in after saying that thing was what happened, I think we have to take that at their word. So I guess at this point, if this is what's true, then the senator assumed that Joey Gargan would have just, after not being awoken by police showing up at the cottage, that he would have thought, well, I'm going down to the ferry house. I'm going to call and report the accident myself. This idea goes back to that Joey'll fix it days of their boyhood. Gargan was mortified by his sense of the senator's motive. He realizes that the senator had swam across the channel not because he intended to go report, but to force Gargan's hand that something had to be done. That the accident had not been reported was bad enough, but for the senator to have misrepresented his intentions, saying he was going to report the accident and then not having done so, really made Gargan angry. He says, this thing is worse now than it was before. We've got to do something. We are reporting the accident right now. Kennedy says, I'm going to say that Mary Jo was driving. There's no way you can say that, Gargan said. You can be placed at the scene. Gargan says, we have got to report this thing. Let's go right now. Markham says that Kennedy is still reluctant. Quote, he is still stuck on the idea of having Mary Jo driving the car. The senator wants to know where there was a telephone he could use. The telephone at the inn was at an inconvenient place. It's all about you, Ted. It's all about your convenience. Gargan knows that all the telephones in Edgartown are going to be like that, with 2 or 3 people lined up to use them, because during the regatta weekends, there's more people than phones. So he says, I was very anxious to get the senator to do the right thing and report the accident. So rather than just walking over to the police station, Gargan says, let's just go to the telephone on Chappie Island out at the ferry house. Let's go. And so Marilyn and Ross Richards, these are the people with whom Ted was just having a nice little chat, says they passed Gargan and Markham and the senator on their way to the ferry. They were obviously in a big rush and looked very preoccupied, Marilyn observed. They passed us without greeting. Well, that would be odd after you had just been chit-chatting for a leisurely little bit, and then all of a sudden they just hustle past you. The senator appeared untroubled on the short ride. He went into the ferry house to call Dave Burke, quote, to alert him to take care of all the details that were going to have to be taken care of. Because obviously now the story was going to get out, Gargan said. Gargan did not hear that conversation. The senator is having the conversation privately, and Gargan and Markham are just staying outside making sure he does. That the senator was still reluctant to report the accident was clear to Markham from the parts that he overheard. Markham, who's standing right outside the ferry house, observes a tow truck's flashing lights on the on time, that ferry that drives things back and forth. So he sees a tow truck, and he goes inside the ferry house to point it out to Ted. Hey, that means that the accident car had been discovered. And Gargan says, now it's essential to report this accident. You've got to do what I've been saying all along. Get your ass over there and report it as fast as you can. Gargan suggests that Markham accompanies the senator to the police station. And under normal circumstances, Gargan would have done it, but he was determined not to be a party to any false report. He knows what Ted's like, and he knows that as long as he's there, he's going to keep saying, come on, let's go ahead and say Mary Jo was the driver. Gargan gets into the Valiant to drive to the cottage, and on the way, he notices La Rosa, Crimmins, the Lyons sisters, that's 2 of them, and Esther Newberg walking on Chappaquiddick Road. The remaining boiler room girls are heading for the landing. Gargan stops the car and tells them to get in, and Nance immediately notices, based on his face, that something's wrong. She says, what's happened? There's been an accident, Gargan said, and he wouldn't say anything else until they get back to the cottage. The senator has been in an automobile accident, and we can't find Mary Jo. Gargan refuses to answer any questions. He says, I didn't fully know what had happened, so the information that I'm giving is limited. I mean, that's convenient. I think this also could be self-protective, that there might be things that he knows that he's still, that haven't been shared even at this point when the book is being published. So he's limiting his information so that whatever is said, he hasn't said something contradictory. Gargan orders Crimmins and LaRosa, get all the stuff together, every bottle, every potato chip. I want this place cleaned up immediately. And he'd return to pick them up later. Nance finds Mary Jo's handbag under a chair in the living room. She says, her pocketbook happened to be next to mine, and I took it when I was collecting my own things. Gargan is repeatedly questioned about the accident on the landing. Where was the accident? What had been done about it? Had the Coast Guard been called? But there were no details given. Nance asks, can't you do something? Isn't there some way that we can have somebody else as the driver of the car? That would be impossible, Gargan says. I don't know why you couldn't be driving the car, Lyons said. Can't somebody else take the blame? There's no way we can do that? Of course not, Gargan said. That's absolutely out of the question. This shows her instincts. And Gargan realizes, you were actually really smart, Joey, to not tell anybody about the accident last night, because you could have gotten everyone involved and they would have been making plans to come up with some sort of alibi. Nance Lyons persists. Why can't we have somebody else driving the car? We can't. That's all. The senator was driving. That's the end of it, Joey says. He tells the girls to stay calm and he'd call later with details, and he drops them off at the Edgartown dock to take a cab to their motel. So they've gone across on the ferry and now they're taking a cab to the motel down at Katama Shores. Gargan went to the police station to find out what was going on. The senator and Paul were now working on an accident report. Gargan did not get a chance to talk to them. Gargan had some sort of understanding that the accident had been found, but no one had said yet, we found Mary Jo. At the Shiretown Inn, Gargan suggested that Treader takes LaRosa's Mercury to return Rosemary Keogh and Susan Tannenbaum to the Katama Shores Motel. So they've apparently been there the whole time. They've been at the hotel. I find this suspicious too, that Rosemary's off in a different group. Anyway, when the Lyons sisters and Esther arrived at the motel, they had gone into Mary Jo's room expecting to find her there. Gargan had used the word tragedy to describe the accident, but they hadn't thought that Mary Jo was dead, just that she was missing. We girls kept hoping that Mary Jo had maybe gotten out of the car too, that maybe she was alive and just wandering around in a daze. Well, Treader shows up with Keogh and Tannenbaum, and he says one of the girls already came out of the room and said, there's been an accident. Something's happened to Mary Jo. Rosemary Keogh was told at this point. The senator drove off a bridge, and we don't know where Mary Jo is. We said, how could it have happened? Does anybody know anything? And nobody did. Treader returns to the inn, and now he's told about the accident, and he begins muttering, I think you ought to go out and talk to the girls. They're very upset. They don't know what to do. So Gargan intends to do that. He says, I wanted to get them off the island as quick as I could. How I was going to do it, I didn't know. Gargan calls the Katama Shores Inn and talks to Nance Lyons. She asks if the accident car had been recovered. He said it had. She asked if Mary Jo had been in the car. He says yes. Gargan was coming to the motel to explain. And so I just want to point out, this fits with the timeline of what Rosemary Keogh's voice sounded like when the policeman calls, that a call had been made and the girls were alerted that Mary Jo had died. Gargan shows up around 11 o'clock and he gives the story. He says, I want you to know that every single effort possible was made to save her. Gargan did not mention his own rescue efforts at this point. We're left again with the question of, did that rescue effort ever happen? You tell me what you think. My mind isn't made up, but Ted didn't mention it in his statement. Apparently their clothes were wet based on the girls' testimony at the cottage. Based on Marilyn's testimony the next morning, he looked like a mess, but she doesn't mention wet clothes. I don't know. Tretter recalls that their own rescue efforts were not mentioned. He said that the senator had called him and Markham out of the cottage to tell what had happened and asked to be driven to the Edgartown ferry, so that's where they went directly. It's possible the rescue attempt didn't happen, or it's possible that they've all just agreed that to keep them out of it, they're not going to mention the rescue effort, that then it could be said that they didn't even know. I'm not sure. Tretter observed a tremendous emotional breakdown of the girls. For 5 or 10 minutes, there was nothing but crying. Gargan's evasive. Some of the girls are angry, of course. They're highly critical that they hadn't been told about the accident when he returned to the cottage, of course. And Joey is still essentially covering for Ted Kennedy. The senator's at the police report. He doesn't know what's being said, and so he gives the 20-year-old and almost 30-year-old young ladies limited information about what has happened. He says, now that I saw the magnitude of the situation, I was even less willing to give the girls specific information. I don't want anything that I said at that time to change whatever factual situation he was presenting. So there is collusion here. There is a sense of he's guarding and limiting his words so that Ted Kennedy can basically say whatever and he'll go along with it. To me, that really lacks integrity. There's a whole lot we can't control in the world. We really can't even control our reputation. But we can control our own decisions, and we can make sure that our own choices line up with what we know to be right. That doesn't mean we always do perfectly. I mean, we all fall short of the glory of God. But we can consistently try to live out what we know to be right. And to me, Joey Gargan is not consistently doing what he says his conscience is telling him to do in these moments. And to me, this part of his conscience of just, I'm going to kind of hold back my words so that whatever he says is the story we can run with, is not honorable. So, Tretter is deputized to take the girls and get them off of the island. Gargan is saying, get them in the car, get them to the ferry, get them out of here. Because remember, even though they're off Chappaquiddick, now they're here on to Martha's Vineyard. Well, Martha's Vineyard is itself an island, and so they've got to get off the island onto the mainland. He wants them out and away from the scene of any of it. Gargan returned to the police station, and Markham shows him the senator's statement. Gargan kind of peruses it. He says he didn't read it very carefully at the time, which doesn't make sense to me. It seems like you'd need to read it very carefully since your whole story is going to depend on whatever was written. He calls the cottage owner to say that the cottage is now vacant, and he arranges for the charter boats, the regatta boats that they had used, to be towed back. Gargan makes a statement to someone that he runs into after he explains the accident. Driscoll asks, why hadn't the accident been reported for 10 hours? And Gargan says, he didn't take my advice. So that's something that does confirm that Gargan in the moment was saying what he said he was saying. Betty Gargan hears about the accident on the radio. She's saddened and distressed by the news. And the party at Chappaquiddick was the typical kind of campaign get-together that she had happily participated in. She says it wasn't a scandalous party, but in light of the unfolding events, it was starting to look like it was. Given the record of previous Kennedy Regatta parties, Gargan had grounds for concern. The parties in 66 and 67 had been riotous affairs. It says the 67 party had left a rental cottage at Katama Beach in shambles. Ray LaRosa's wife is upset when she's told about the accident. LaRosa had not known a party was planned when he accepted the invitation to come to Edgartown for the regatta. Gargan had accomplished his cleanup detail with customary dispatch and efficiency. He had left no evidence behind that a party had taken place at all. And all the guests who had attended had escaped before the police even knew they were there. So Gargan sees it as job done. The whole problem about reporting that accident, Gargan tells us, is the little island. If the accident had taken place in Edgartown, nothing would have shaped up as it did. There would have been communication. We would have all been together. I mean, this is all ignoring the fact that there's a public telephone right by the ferry, right? Nonsense. Gargan regretted having rented the cottage. He doesn't want to be a party to the discussion of the accident or why it hadn't been reported for 10 hours. Markham had written out a description of the accident from the senator's dictation. He corrected errors in grammar, but played no part in the deception the senator had practiced in failing to mention the party at Chappaquiddick and his claim to have been, quote, in shock after the party. So Markham identifies there's at least 2 points of deception in Ted Kennedy's statement. Number one, there's no mention of the party. Number two, the claim of being in shock. That's Markham's assessment. Gargan says, maybe I should have realized that the senator was in more trouble than I thought. So I missed it, and so did Paul. He points to the moment that the senator takes 3 steps and starts swimming. And he says, up until that point, I'm still thinking I'm dealing with a guy that I've known for 30 years, who has always done what he says he's going to do. I mean, he's saying that, but also he's known Teddy Kennedy for 30 years, right? The senator had told Markham nothing about the rate of speed or the quantity of alcohol consumed, but the wrong turn was particularly puzzling. When he saw the senator leave the cottage, quote, the assumption was he was going to the ferry. Gargan says where he went, what he did, if he stopped somewhere or did something else, I don't know. He could have changed his mind about getting out of the ferry. All kinds of things could have happened after he went out of the door of the cottage. It's entirely possible he went down that road deliberately to take a swim. Gargan did not believe that the senator was taking Mary Jo to the beach to make love to her. He said, that doesn't make any sense. They both had comfortable hotel rooms across the ferry. So it didn't make sense for them at that time to skip the ferry and go down to the beach. The senator had not mentioned the rescue attempt by Gargan and Markham at the bridge in his police report. According to Markham, Kennedy says, look, I don't want to put you people in the middle of this. I'm not going to involve you. As far as you know, you don't know anything about the accident. Damore points out for us that with Markham at the police station and Gargan having already put in 2 appearances there, Arena would have had 2 witnesses available to corroborate the senator's accident report. By, quote, not involving them, the senator was guaranteeing that Markham and Gargan wouldn't be questioned. He muses, was Kennedy protecting himself from revealing that 2 lawyers had known about the accident hours before he had gone to the police, and that those lawyers had repeatedly urged him to report the accident, advice that he refused to follow? So Damore thinks that not mentioning Markham and Gargan has nothing to do with protecting them or keeping them out of it, but rather self-protection. As it was, Arena was a police officer of unusual goodwill, accommodating to the point of indulgence in his treatment of the senator, Markham said. The police chief appeared to have accepted Senator's accident report at face value. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. These have been good chapters though, haven't they? I'm really enjoying this. I think it's helping to get all the details straight in my head of who was where and what was happening. Whether or not we know their internal motivations, we can always take their words and match them up against their actions. And for me, that's a really helpful exercise. I hope it is for you as well. So here are our observations from chapter 14. Ted Kennedy had swum the channel. He had established his presence with the employee, and he had woken up at 7 a.m. That's his account of his movements. Around 7:15 or 7:30, quote, he looks normal in every way. Then he calls Helga to alert her. We note not his wife. He did not call his wife. He has clammy skin, and he is involved in innocent conversations in his little yachting outfit. Around 8:30, Gargan comes up. He is sweaty, he's messy, he's physically out of sorts. He insists on talking to Ted. There's aggression and urgency that's noted by others. Gargan and Markham are shocked that he didn't report, and the senator claims that he thought after an hour passed, Gargan would have gone and reported it himself. Ted Kennedy still wants to say that Mary Jo was the driver, and Gargan makes what I think is a weird suggestion. Go to the phone at the ferry landing across the water on Chappaquiddick. So they go over on a ferry. Paul Markham comes in while Ted's making phone calls and says there's a tow truck coming. So they tell Kennedy, go to the police. And Paul, Markham, and Ted do go to the police. Gargan goes to the Boiler Room girls. He's evasive. He gives them no details, but his goal is get them off of the island. Everyone thinks that the real problem is that it was Chappaquiddick. Not that it was Ted and his decision making. Not that any of them were at fault, but that the real problem is just that this all happened on a very isolated island. And if it had happened anywhere else, then there would have been reporting. Of course, that belies the fact that there were houses with phones. There were houses with lights on. There was a phone at the ferry landing. So all of that is obfuscation to me. Well, there we have it, chapters 13 and 14. I hope you're enjoying it. We are going to be starting this. I believe on Mondays we are going to do our Radium Girls read. So let's get into this. I believe we're going to do a couple of chapters for our first episode. So if you want to read ahead, go ahead and read chapters 1 and 2, and we will talk about them on Monday. And if you've enjoyed this, I do hope that you will like and subscribe to the channel. And then if you know of a friend who is interested in topics like these or could be interested in the Radium Girls, go ahead and send them a link to the playlist and let them see if this is something they would be interested in, because we'd love for more friends to join. I hope you guys have a great day. See you later. Bye.